Okay, it's 1:58. This is an hour and 58 minutes after we were, like, supposed to start this, which is, absolutely grand.
Yeah.
So,
1700s.
I guess it's the first episode of the, Brainlet podcast. I'll be ranting for like 2 hours. It's gonna be great.
I hope to God there's not more.
Anyhow, I am joined over Discord by good old, what's your face? I can't remember any names today. It's a great day. So we got, jolly old Officer Porter. So we got Ethan. Who else is with us? We got Marcus and, good old Aarmon. And Alyssa can't join us for some reason, who knows. But she has notes on here, so this is cool.
Actually, I don't know. Should I call her?
We already got started with this, so let's continue, I guess.
Yeah, that's good, I guess.
Special guest.
Oh yeah, we got our special guest, good old Joseph Lara in the background of Frontier Empire Productions. Is he gone?
And I'm Joseph Lara. Here at my studio at Frontier Empire Productions, we provide audio equipment to make podcasts like these possible. Enjoy the show, everybody.
One hell of a
Oh boy.
guy. One hell of a
So there's your daily advertisement, I guess. And so this is a good old 1850's podcast. Of all the topics we could have had for a podcast, I wasn't quite sure we'd do 1850's, but at the very least, it's pretty interesting.
I mean, we were 10 years from greatness, but I'll take it.
Yeah.
Those 10 years before those 10 years of greatness were pretty stressful, I'll tell you that. So, we got Red Dead Redemption 2 in the background and a bunch of people trying to kill each other over politics. So, that's the 1850's in a nutshell.
It's kind of like the awkward teenage years, you know?
Pretty much. So, 1850. That starts off this terrible set of years. So, January 29th, that was good old compromise of 1850. So, what's his face? Henry Clay. So at this time, people were pretty heated over the debate about slavery. It hasn't hit its breaking point, but we're getting somewhere. And Henry Clay wanted to have some kind of compromise. So in January, he introduced a set of bills that would eventually pass. We'll talk about that later, but so let's get to something a bit more fun before we get there. So the Scarlet Letter got published that same year on March 16th. If you had Hooper's class, whoever did a presentation on that was not happy about that book.
It was really it's so monotone. I felt so bad for them.
Well, I guess it's better than killing each other for slavery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Hawthorne, nah, I'll pass. We got our first death of this year. So on the 9th of July that year, good old Zachary Taylor, he died.
Yeah.
He just straight up died in the White House. He didn't die, he just died. So we had Millard Fillmore taking presidency, and his name will come up later with the Know Nothings and that whole interesting party.
Mm-hmm.
And finally after a couple months, Compromise of 1850 got passed, and that was a set of 5 bills. So the whole deal with that is we got territory from the Mexican-American War, which was 46 through 48, and we're quite sure what to do with it. So that set of 5 bills got passed. Someone bring up. Let's discuss what exactly was in that set of bills. It's probably a good idea.
Part of the Compromise of 1850 was the Fugitive Slave Act. Sort of made it so that the North had to. The North was expected to return slaves that fled. California entered the Union. Territorial government was created in Utah. There is a boundary dispute between Texas and New Mexico. That was sort of amended.
California's a mistake.
No, I mean, we got gold from it at least, so it serves some kind of purpose. But,
Okay, it's lived out its lifespan. We can cut it off from the mainland.
It was a big deal though when California was entering the Union though, because it upset the balance between slave states and the free states, and so people were sort of trying to figure out where California lay because it could affect politics for like next upcoming years.
and it still does.
Always a problem.
Yeah,
Good
it's,
old
yeah.
California.
It still does. Yeah.
So, 1850s passed by with some of those things going on. Then we wake up to 1851, and we go over to good old Great Britain because we have some interesting things going on for once. So, from the 1st of May to the 15th of October, we had, and I quote, the Great Exhibition of Works of Industry of All Nations. Or, if you're not pretentious, it's called the Great Exhibition, or the Crystal Palace Exhibition, because it was hosted in, guess what, a Crystal Palace kind of structure here. I'm gonna pull a Joe Rogan. Someone else just pull that up real quick. And we can talk about the good old inventions and wonderful things introduced here. Okay, someone pulled up the wrong thing. It works.
Great Expedition.
That was the intro to. Where
Okay,
is it?
so, someone pull that up real quick. Okay, where'd it go? Great expedition.
Hello.
Okay, this is actually gonna go on for like 2 hours, like a real podcast. So,
Isn't that what podcasts are supposed to do?
pretty
I don't
much.
know.
Oh, we got like
That
10
would be a
minutes.
great
Let's
one,
talk
but-
about something interesting, like how cannabis was literally used as common medicine. Have a headache? Just take some cannabis extract. You know.
You know,
That's
that's
smart.
without headaches, this whole slavery issue caused, I can imagine cannabis would be pretty useful.
Yeah.
God damn. So I guess we're going to ignore the inventions of the Great Exhibition. So let's move on so we don't run out of time too much. So let's go back to people killing each other over slavery. So on September 11th, not 2001, 1851, we had the Christina riot in Pennsylvania.
It's a bad rap with 2000.
Honestly, though. So we got a bit of a skirmish going on here between a group of African Americans and white abolitionists. So the good old Fugitive Slave Act passed the previous year, and a group of people wanted to go capture 4 of these fugitive slaves in the town. So they had a fight over that in Christina. And so one member of the posse got killed, and we had 2 other people wounded. And in the end, after this riot, 37, let's see. What was I missing? Yeah, 37 African Americans and 1 white guy got arrested and charged with treason because of this Fugitive Slave Act. Ain't that fun?
Like, do you mean literally or figuratively?
No, they got charged with treason. Most of them got acquitted in the end, but just imagine being charged with treason over, escaped slaves. You're just out there, protesting some escaped slaves because there's a riot happening. You go get arrested and they say, "You're treasonous to this country!" Just imagine that. Not fun.
I can't imagine it would be, It's one of those things you wake up in the morning, it's like, I didn't think I'd be being charged for treason today,
Speaking of things that aren't fun,
stuff.
Moby Dick got published in October.
There's a lot of
Melville,
books that I hate.
he really liked the whales, I guess.
Ocean Man.
Take me by the hand, lead me to the land that you understand. Let's move on. Anyone want to talk about the 1852s?
1852. I'm gonna take a hard pass.
Mm, Not
Anyway,
much
so
really happened.
1852 wasn't too.
oh,
Oh.
Uncle Tom's Cabin was published. I guess that's pretty big.
No,
That inspired a
guess.
lot of the anti-slavery movement. I guess.
you know,
It inspired a lot of the anti-slavery movement. It opened up a lot of empathy and a lot of North and Southern people's hearts towards the whole slavery not being a morally acceptable thing.
yeah, because
It
before that,
ended up playing a big role, and it was one of the most sold books within the entire world.
yeah, because
It's pretty
before that they
impressive.
didn't really. A lot of people were just kind of
Illiterate.
meh towards slavery. They didn't have anything. They didn't know much about it. Now, when this got published, they finally had some kind of reason to emphasize. I can't speak today. With the slaves, and that sparked quite a bit of quite a large amount of people actually caring about anti-slavery. The other pretty majorly important thing in 1852 was the election of Franklin Pierce. So he was a Democrat, and he defeated General Winfield Scott for the presidency that year. One of his main big promises was his support for the Compromise of 1850, which had a decent amount of issues by this time. And let's move into 1853. Of course, Franklin
Matthew
Pierce gets
Perry.
inaugurated into the office. And we had quite a few other things happening around the world. So, still talking about America-ish. We had Commodore Matthew C. Perry and his gunboats. They went up to Japan, and they said, open up, with guns pointed at their faces. You know, you had these big old boats with guns. And that wasn't too...
Gunboats.
Gunboats, yes. So we
Yeah,
had
it
a
was
thing
18
called gunboat diplomacy. It's basically you stick a gun in someone's face, they'll probably do what you want. And that's what happened. Because U.S. ships got allowed into Japan after we shoved guns in their faces. Yay, America.
Flaunting.
Also in 1853, the USS Pampero was launched. It was a 1,375 ton ship. It was part of the Navy. It was used later to help patrol various Gulf ports in the Confederate States. It was big during the actual Civil War later on, and it was when it was first came out. Also, Stonewall Jackson, who was big later on in Civil War, he got married to Eleanor Junkin.
Ding dong.
Oh, and Charles Darwin receives the Royal Medal of the Royal Society. So, he's a big boy now.
Oh, Carl, was the boat that Aarmon mentioned in Azure Lane?
No, good question. I'm not quite sure. Probably.
Probably.
I don't know.
That's So anyway, yeah, the U.S. military is flexing their boats, and they will be flexing their boats later on in the Civil War.
And the Gadsden Purchase between the United States and Mexico is finalized. Well, it was finalized in 1853. It was proposed finalized 1854. Proposed 1853. The United States was agreeing to pay Mexico about $10 million for a portion of Mexico, which later became the very state we live in, Arizona, and also
Southern
part
New
of New
Mexico.
Mexico.
So if there wasn't a Gadsden Purchase, I probably wouldn't be here making a podcast for IB History HL. But I guess we are.
That's fair. Yeah.
Oh, speaking of other things, so the Old West was still kind of a thing during the 1850s. And one of the more iconic guns was created. We got the pattern 1853 Enfield. It's a nice old rifle, and was used in the Crimean War, which was that 1853 or 1854?
1854.
Yeah. And I think it was
1854.
1856.
Oh, pull that up. Look that up real quick.
Got you. Yeah.
1856.
1853 to 1856.
Yeah, so the 1853 Enfield was a quite popular weapon during that war. I got some other stuff being used there. Speaking of guns, that next year, 1854, you got the Treby chain gun being invented.
The weirdest firearm.
So, experimental as it was awfully weird. You had 14 chambers of 52. Just,
are those that kind of gun? The
Yeah.
kind with like a bunch of different chambers? God, those were awful. I have no idea who thought that was a good idea.
You know, I mean, it led up to things like the Maxim gun and the
Yeah, it
Gatling
led
gun.
up
If you
to
think
it.
about it, it's the
It
same
was
concept
like
as modern day machine guns. It's just a giant rope with bullets.
Yeah. It got us somewhere. You know, if we had the 1860s, we could be talking about the Gatling gun, but that's after our time. But stuff like this led up to it.
Oh, this is 1853, right?
Well,
I
around
believe
1854.
the first. Oh well, 1853, the first manned glider was created by George Cayley. So yeah, that's pretty interesting. You know, you can jump on one of those glider things and glide around a little bit. The
Was
first
it-
successful one. I mean, other people tried.
I can
did they
imagine
live?
earlier some. Oh.
We don't know, and I don't really want to know. If you think about it.
Whatever.
Because somebody had to report that, and I'm pretty sure nobody would actually go with them because they thought they were insane to begin with.
That's
I proved them wrong. So, I guess we're going back to 1854. So,
1854.
we had
Four-stroke
the
engine.
Know Nothing Party. So,
We'll start there.
great group of people, aren't they? Anti-Catholic, they hated immigrants, and they were a secret society. Oh, they also hated Native Americans, so
They hated everybody, basically.
pretty much. So the reason why they're called a know-nothings, besides being having nothing in their brain, was so since they were a secret society originally, the default response to all members was to say that they knew nothing about the party. So that's
Kind of
fun.
like the first.
Was that actually was that name given to them, or was that name their chosen sort of?
Their chosen
title?
name was the Know Nothing Party. Then in 55, they got renamed to like the American Party. They still didn't know anything, but they changed their name.
Also, 1854, the four-stroke engine was patented. It's the premises behind the four-stroke engine
Can you say that again, Aarmon?
deals with intake, compression, combustion, and exhaust through like different rotations of crankshafts and stuff. Today, engines which use the four-stroke system are referred to as auto engines, which I don't know, it's pretty interesting. Your car might run off of it.
So, as America teared itself apart with hate, at least we have engines.
yeah.
That's kind of important. Ooh, 1855.
The largest merchant vessel in the world at the time was also sunk at this time. It was called the RMS Taylor. There's a loss of about 372 lives.
That's not
Pretty
fun.
unfortunate. It's a big boat.
Man, we're just gonna talk about nothing but death for the next half of this podcast. Fun.
Oof. We are talking about guns.
Well, yeah, it kind of goes hand in hand. So, January, we got the Panama Railroad, which was that connected two parts of the world. Rather important. And in terms of great literature during the time, Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman was published on the 4th of July. Very fitting day. And finally, we get to death. We got Bleeding Kansas beginning in November.
1854, we should probably talk about Kansas-Nebraska Act.
Oh, yeah. So, to lead into Bleeding Kansas, we had the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And if you want to expand on that, Aarmon.
So now I'm going to have to pull something up on it.
This is the Joe Rogan Experience, guys. Thank you for watching.
Kansas-Nebraska Act.
So what can we talk about here? Because that was a rather influential act being passed during this time.
It allowed Kansas and Nebraska, the two separate territories, to decide for themselves whether or not they wanted slavery within their borders. A lot of the North were angry at the Kansas-Nebraska Act because they viewed it as a continuation of the Missouri Compromise, which they already believed was a strong benefit for the South and didn't actually benefit the North. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery supporters rushed in, settle Kansas, so that way they could affect politics for the upcoming 10 years or so. So there was that was what led into the whole bleeding Kansas thing, because you had a bunch of people who strongly believed that slavery should be a thing. You had a bunch of people who didn't, and there was a big conflict between the two. So, yeah.
You'd think a vote would be fair until you get people flooding from all over the country to put their 2 cents into the vote.
Eventually, pro-slavery supporters ended up winning in Kansas, but Congress refused to recognize the Constitution adopted by the pro-slavery settlers because they were charged with election fraud.
Fun.
So you get to see a little bit more of some government officials and stuff who aren't following what they should be following, which still happens now. Like if you look at like Trump and stuff, a lot of people talk about how they think that Russians and stuff were involved in his presidency. It's just something to keep in mind because it's
modern day
a
connection.
reoccurring theme throughout American history.
America. So, speaking of politicians, so 1856, the politicians had it at this point because good old Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, it got beat with a cane.
I remember this.
So Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina, he didn't like his speeches about the whole anti-slavery thing. So he literally gets this whole studded cane, and he beats him in front of the whole Senate.
I'm just imagining drunk history.
Use your mind.
Oh, yeah.
You
That was an interesting description.
You just get this guy
I feel
walks
like
up
things
with a
like that
cane,
just don't
and he
happen
starts
as much.
beating you over in the head, though.
Yeah.
I mean, when was the last time you saw someone get beat up with a cane?
Drunk history.
It's been a
that
while,
episode.
actually.
Yeah, it has. People don't use cans as much.
That's
Well,
true.
I mean, old people.
Yeah, and people with like your limbs screwed up, so yeah.
That too.
I think that's about all for 1855. Is there anything else that's like...
we're at
really
1856 now. That's because that was May 22nd.
Oh yeah.
So 1855, nothing too monumental was happening. So 1856, we're on to more interesting things. So yeah, Charles Sumner event. Yeah, we talked about event in the 22nd of May, which that struck parallels between the violence seen by the regular citizens over slavery and the actual politicians losing it. And then we flash back on May 24th to the citizens taking violence in arms. Because John Brown and his group of abolitionists...
Can we go back to 1856 real quick?
We're
I don't
on
know if you talked about it,
1856.
but... okay. Douglas tried to join Democratic Party nomination again, which is like the second time, which is sort of big because he's a big player in the later elections.
Yeah,
That's it.
Back to John Brown. So on May 24th and then May 25th, so Lawrence, Kansas was sacked by pro-slavery forces. So John Brown and his anti-slavery settlers came with a bunch of rifles in a Potawatomi, or however you pronounce that, and they go and just kill 5 people. And that was quite a bloody part of bleeding Kansas. You have more just smaller acts of violence throughout Kansas at this time, but they just go up with their group of people and just shoot 5 people. Which not fun.
A lot of the violence and the stuff that you see in 1850s didn't really you don't really see it again till like post-Civil War into like the 1950s civil rights movements and stuff. Yeah, a lot of the violence during this time was sort of just like a decade thing, or a lot of it sort of died down for a while.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we had the Civil War, so
Yeah, well, post-Civil War.
yeah. Speaking of wars, we have wars in other places. So,
Ooh, where?
China wasn't happy about Britain bringing opium in for the second time.
It's
So we had the
back.
second opium war in October. Ain't that fun? Yep.
You doing?
November 4th, Buchanan. So James Buchanan. So he won the election, and he was president until we got the 1860s election, and I assume they'll talk about that in their group.
Yeah.
Someone want to start off 1857 here?
1857. That's Dred Scott, I believe, right?
Yeah, Dred Scott. Yeah.
Yeah.
Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a huge case this year. So more or less, Dred Scott is he's an influential figure because of his attempts at cases into the Supreme Court. So at this time, Democrats were trying to seek a repeal of Missouri Compromise, and they succeeded to an extent with Kansas-Nebraska Act and stuff, where they would have a second chance to try to influence more of politics with their anti-slavery groups and stuff. Dude, I don't know where to start. There's so much with Dred Scott.
I mean, if we just want to read off the ruling. So, I'll just quote the Supreme Court on this. So they held that and I quote, a Negro whose ancestors were imported into the United States, sold as slaves, whether enslaved or free, could not be an American citizen and therefore had no standing to sue in federal court. And the federal government had no power to regulate slavery in the federal territories acquired after the creation of the United States.
The idea was Dred Scott had traveled with his slave owner or whatever through territories that were considered free, where there weren't slaves. And after leaving those territories, and after the death of like his master or whatever, he tried to leave, because at the time his slave owner had died, passed away, and his wife had tried to take Dred Scott and his Dred Scott's wife under her jurisdiction. But they had been through free locations, and in those free locations, there is no slavery. So the idea was that he deserved to be free because he had gone through these places where he should have been, and so he tried to sue the wife of his former owner, but it ended up not going through. The court decided to shut it down, and it was really big, because that meant that the court was spitting on the constitutions that were created by anti-slave states. So this was big because it was like a clear bias towards slave owners at the time. It was huge, all over the news, that kind of stuff.
So that was keep going.
It created more sectionalism and stuff between different parties. It promoted the idea of a strengthened opposition to slavery, because the North at that time were beginning to believe that it was never going to be abandoned. Until then, more or less, a lot of people believed that over time slavery would just drift away. But this decision sort of discouraged a lot of those people. So they wanted to come forth and try to break slavery while they still could.
So definitely a major event, and one that divided the country even more. To make matters worse, we had the Great Panic of 1857 in August that year. So besides just the whole country being divided, we had the New York branch of Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company completely failing, which caused a domino effect. So a bunch of other businesses failed, and a lot of people lost money there. So besides hating everyone else in the country, you're broke too now. So great times.
Yeah,
You know what that
honestly,
reminds me of?
hemp.
What's going on now?
What were you gonna say, Marcus?
I was gonna say, history, economic wise, just money wise in general, reminds me of 2008 quite a bit.
So here's the thing, right? Banks run off of debt, especially like banks where the country runs with the fiat currency. By that I mean the country has no backing behind their currency. Like for example, the U.S. dollar doesn't. You can't trade it. You can't trade it directly for gold. That kind of thing, right? And so the Panic of 1857 is like just another example throughout history of banks falling because their debt systems begin to fail. When somebody doesn't pay back their debt, that bank begins to lose money. And if something happens and a lot of people go to those banks to withdraw the money, the bank's already given that money away in loans, so they don't have enough money to. They physically don't have enough money to give people what they own. So this is like just another big example throughout history of banks sort of failing.
So is this just a big advertisement for Bitcoin?
No.
Boy, Bitcoin's down.
I think that's about it for 1857. Is there any other big things that happened then?
Nah, nothing, because 1858 led us right into the election of 1860, because Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln had their very much famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. So there were 7 of them in good old Illinois, my homeland, while they were running for a Senate seat. Even though Douglas won that election, these debates pretty much set in stone that Lincoln was a great debater and he had quite a few skills. This advertised him across the country, which helped him win the 1860s election, which we talked about in our presentation a couple months back in IB History HL, if you remember that.
That was a really good presentation, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Minnesota, at this time, Minnesota is also accepted as a 32nd state, and jumping to not quite across the world, but jumping out of America real quick. This is actually the year Charles Darwin goes public with his views on evolution, which is very big.
Which would later be
anybody want to talk about the importance? Oh,
so
yeah,
that
well,
changed scientific understanding of biology and how we came to be quite a bit.
The idea of evolution also promoted what's now modern day atheism to an extent, because people no longer believed quite as much into the Bible stories of how people came to exist and stuff. There were still like a lot of scientists who were scientists but also believed in like Christianity, but this was just one step forward in like an atheist modern movement sort of. It also provided a backbone for people who were already firm in their belief that white people are superior to like black people and Asian people and all that sort. It promoted the idea of scientific racism. What's the proper term? Does anybody know?
Darwinism.
Social Darwinism.
That's,
So that's the idea that white men rule the world, followed by like Asian people, followed by like Native American and black people, that sort of thing. It's a really unfortunate take on such a great scientific discovery or theory.
Yeah.
It's just big. That's like an overall world thing. Doesn't necessarily have to do with exclusively America. It's just big.
Yeah, you get something out there, and then people will twist it any way they want to perceive.
It reminds me a lot of what were the theories behind it's fascism, right? Where the certain country believes that their race, their lineage is like the superior race and should inherit, like with the Aryan race or with
evolution is used a lot in like in
Oh yeah.
people trying to prove their
Conquer other
worldview.
people. Yeah.
Also, this time Theodore Roosevelt was born. I mean, it's not technically super important at this time. Just something interesting to keep in mind.
He'll become interesting later. I don't think we're covering it in any of these podcasts, but you know, Roosevelt's a pretty important person to American history. But 1859.
Oh, Denver, Colorado. Denver, Colorado was founded too.
Oh boy. Wasn't
yeah,
Texas
there's
founded around this time as well?
I'm not sure.
Hold on. It's not Texas, but Dallas.
This was just sort of big because there's sort of a mini gold rush to this location. It's just interesting.
Oh, hold on, I gotta look this up real quick. Texas Airport.
1859, guys. 1859 is juicy.
Whoa.
Might not be. I guess it wasn't Texas. Yeah, Minnesota was 32nd. Texas Rangers were doing their stuff in good old state. Oh, that was earlier. Okay, whatever. Let's go on to 1859. So we talked about John Brown earlier, right?
Yeah.
So you know how he killed a good group of people in Kansas? Oh, John Brown's at it again!
Started a slave insurrection. Yeah.
So he tried to raid Harper's Ferry. And now he got some people going. But in the end, it wasn't very successful. They had, Robert E. Lee kind of shut him down.
Yeah, Robert E. Lee kind of arrived there, shut him down. He didn't even get the numbers he had really expected. His previous slave insurrection attempts were a lot more successful. And I believe at this time, if I'm not mistaken, he was also captured. Am I mistaken there?
Yeah. He got captured, and on December 2nd, he got hanged.
Feels bad, man.
For the North, he was a martyr. In the South, he was a traitor. So that, once again, led to quite a bit of divide within the country.
It's really just foreshadowing for the entire war, to be honest. Like there were so many political divides and stuff. It's rough. Also, this year, Charles Dickens published his Tale of Two Cities.
Finally, some
just a
decent
big book.
piece of literature
A
we have on here.
good book, yes.
Oh, no, it doesn't. Who doesn't like Moby Dick? Anyway, so let's end it off with some good literature, I guess, because 1860s people should be covering the next part. They get the interesting election and everything.
Is there anything else you think we should touch? Like,
well, I mean, just to conclude, so I mean, the 1850s in general was just a very divided period of American history, and everything just broke out into chaos after the election.
It was honestly just tensions rising. It was the time before the climax.
The teenagers.
There weren't a whole lot of big inventions at this time, but some notable ones that you might want to keep in mind. First dishwasher was patented in 1850 by Joel Houghton. First man glider, George Cayley. The first sewing machines were invented, which is sort of big, not like revolutionary, super big, but
it would become revolutionary.
It would become revolutionary with the later changes to his beginning inventions, and yeah, that's about it. Invention-wise, not terribly impressive time. There weren't a whole lot of really big guns or whatever that were released. There were little steps, but there wasn't anything big until the Gatling gun in the 60s. Yeah, it was really just to conclude, it was a period of just rising tensions and stuff.
All around the world, even.
Ooh, rising tensions and Charles Dickens. That guy was pretty popular around this time.
Yep, and
apparently beating people with canes pretty popular too.
That's true. You don't see that often anymore, but I guess if you're a senator in the 1850s, watch out for canes. What else do we have? The Crimean War was a thing. It's not too...
I feel like in AP World History, we talked about like some sort of a worldview type thing with scientists at this time. I forget what it was though.
Ooh,
Do any of you guys know what I'm talking about?
no, I'm not quite sure. As someone that got 5 on that test, I don't know. Oh, speaking of AP World, yeah, the one thing we did forget to mention, India wasn't having a good time either. They had their own little war because they had the Indian mutiny against British rule in the country, and
Because they put pig fat in their bullets. Right?
yep, and that's that kind of conflicted with their religion and everything. So there was a war, and the British East India Company didn't have too much of a good time. So yeah, just in all, 1850s had a lot of tension going on, a lot of wars, lots of fights, lots of violence.
It brought the pot to a very high boil.
Pretty much. And they did have pot too, so
Oh,
at least they could get through it somewhat nicely. That's about it. You guys have anything else to add before I close this off?
My cannabis extract. Straight from Wisconsin. Oh, God.
Oh gosh. Well, that was 1850s. That was I feel like a brainlet after making this podcast though. But any other questions, please email us or ask me in class. If we're watching this in class, I am sorry that this podcast was like 40 minutes.
It was so long. Jesus Christ.
Anyway.
I don't know how we made it so long. I thought it was going to be way shorter.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Williams. I'm sorry. I gotta put a note from it.
Sorry.
Anyway, that's it. Thank you for listening, even though it was terrible. And have a great... Oh yeah, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. And so that's Carl Zielinski. And then Joseph's is Frontier Empire Productions, who provided the microphone for Ethan and himself. So anyway, have a great day, guys, and I'll see you soon.
Peace.